get underway?
Yeah, go for it, Rob.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. I'm very happy to welcome online Dr. Lindsay Richards, who is lecturer in sociology at the University of Oxford and co-author of the report that we're here to talk about this morning, The Childhood Origins of Social Mobility. Also here is Dr. Jackie Guy, who is part of the Social Mobility Commission team. Jackie is Deputy Director of Evidence and Analysis. Lindsay and Jackie will be talking you through the main points that have come out of the updated Childhood Origins report, which we published on our website this morning, you'll be pleased to know. Thank you both for joining me today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights. There will be time to ask Lindsay, Jackie, and also myself questions later. We have an hour together, so that should be plenty of time. So please either post questions in the chat or ask away at the end of our presentation. So let me begin then by talking a little bit about why we commissioned this updated report. At the SMC, we're interested in the role parents have in their children's mobility outcomes. One of our key pillars of work is called Nurturing Talent, where we're looking at the role of families and what children learn at home, as well as the role of preschool and school in improving social mobility. I hope that most of us will remember having a parent helping us with our homework when we were young or taking us out somewhere special for the day. Those of us who look after children ourselves will, I'm sure, have fond memories of taking the kids to the park on a sunny day, or perhaps less fond memories of puzzling over their homework. Now, I'm pretty sure homework got much harder in the last couple of decades since I was looking after my children. These types of activities, the environments children grow up in, and the attitudes and values children are surrounded with form an important part of many children's ability and resilience to succeed. But to what extent does a parent's socioeconomic status affect their ability to access the activities and resources that will support their child's life chances? And do children from more affluent backgrounds always come out on top? These are the questions that Lindsay and her co-authors looked at when writing the Childhood Origins report. And what they found is that the evidence is not at all clear-cut. The findings from this latest update report reveal a picture far more complex and nuanced than rich kids do well and are better supported, or poor kids do badly. When compiling the report, we looked at what parents from different socioeconomic backgrounds do with their children, like helping with their homework, as well as what they have in a practical sense. We looked at issues like well-being and the experiences at school and examined how all these factors influence the chances of a child doing well. So with those introductory remarks, I hope I've helped to set the scene for you. And I'll now pass over to Lindsay, who'll take 10 minutes to go into the report's findings in more detail. So over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Rob. I think that's a really good introduction. This report sort of ended up quite big, didn't it? We covered a lot of ground in it, and I'm not going to attempt to sort of describe every single thing that we found. And in fact, I thought that I would sort of present some of the findings in this webinar in terms of 3 or 4 key points about how I think we should be interpreting the report. So I'll mention these points and then they'll be illustrated with some of the key things coming out of our report. So firstly, as Rob has already mentioned, this is a revised and updated version of a report that we originally worked on in 2016. I was part of that team. And that report, in turn, was inspired by a book that had just come out by the American political scientist Robert Putnam, Bob Putnam as he's known. And one of the key concepts in this book, sort of in the introduction to this book, he points out the fact that we often study social mobility after it's happened. When we look at what's happened to adults, we're sort of saying, this person was upwardly mobile, this person was downwardly mobile, this person wasn't mobile at all. And he wanted to sort of shine a light on like mobility in action, right? So pointing out some of those things that are going to affect the social mobility of kids in the future. We don't know what they're going to become yet. They're still kids. So I think it's important to just bear this context in mind. You know, it's not like the book isn't a manual to parenting. It sort of covers some things that, you know, are really sort of fall outside of that simple scope, I would say. But I think it's nice to keep this context in mind, and that's the context in which then we look at what parents have, and we can think about their kind of, in the academic literature, we call it social capital and cultural capital. So those social ties, the neighbourhoods we live in, the kind of culture and values that we hold. And then, as Rob also mentioned as well, we emphasise what parents do with their children. This might be helping with homework and doing cultural outings to museums. We also cover things like the, you know, quality of the relationship between parents and kids. And then we also have a section where we're sort of zooming in on the lives of those children themselves, thinking about their well-being and so on. So that's the sort of first sort of contextual point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is a quite sort of academic-y one, apologies. So we make this distinction in the report. We use the terms probabilistic versus deterministic. And the essential point here is that there's not a single item in the report of the, you know, tons of things we look at where we say 100% of the well-educated parents are doing a thing and none of the uneducated parents. It's just never like that, right? We in social sciences, we're always talking about probabilistic differences. So sometimes we're talking about, you know, 40% of the higher socioeconomic background parents are doing one thing versus 20% of the other group. So it's never as simple as, you know, all the kids from a certain background have a certain kind of upbringing. It's a mixed and complex picture. So Rob also alluded to this as well. The picture is actually quite complex and subtle. We sometimes get a picture that includes what we might call, doing like air quotes here, a reverse social gradient. And that term really implies, yes, not what we expected to see. So there are some items where we see the lower socioeconomic parents sort of helping with homework every day. They're more likely to say every day than the higher socioeconomic parents. So we sometimes see these sort of, you know, complex patterns, not always going in the same direction. On those items where we look at parents doing these activities with their children, it's not just helping with homework, it's also those activities you might do with really young children, you know, stimulating and fun activities, reading, doing activities like telling stories and music. On some of those items, we also find a picture of greater inequality amongst the lower socioeconomic group, which we have more parents saying they do this activity every day, but also more saying that they never do it. So we get this quite complex picture emerging. So overall, I would say, you know, if I wanted to just sort of summarize the bigger picture, I think on average, we do see that kids growing up in households with higher socioeconomic class parents, socioeconomic status parents, you know, they tend to live in neighborhoods that have more amenities. They tend to get more cultural engagement, and they tend to have more time spent on them in their preschool years, and they tend to be doing a bit better in terms of their well-beings. But as we've already alluded to, there are some exceptions to this general picture. So the next point I wanted to make is that we ought to be interpreting these results without a value judgment. you know, and saying, you know, gosh, look at these parents who aren't doing this thing, aren't they awful? But to rather, you know, sort of think through what some of the reasons might be. So one of the examples that I often use is the example of eating family meals together, which is one of the items included in the report. So a story from my own background to illustrate this is, you know, when I was a teenager, I had, my mum was a nurse and worked shifts, and if she was on a late shift, she wouldn't get home until 10 p.m. and maybe if she was working nights, she might be asleep when we wanted to eat. So we certainly did not eat family meals together every day, or even 5 or 6 times a week. It was probably less than that. So this is just to illustrate that there are, you know, circumstances in families, in households that might dictate what parents can and can't do. But we do tend to see on those type of items, indeed, that, you know, kids in higher socioeconomic households are a bit more likely to eat family meals together regularly. They're also a bit more likely to have good relationships between the parents and the children. We looked at items to do with whether children and parents talk about things that matter, how frequently they quarrel, for example. And we do, I think, see a picture there of like a bit more sort of strain in the households with the lower socioeconomic status. But as I've already alluded to, I think there are probably some good reasons for this. And as we'll get to as well, you know, there will be perhaps other issues going on in those low socioeconomic status households, like the children might be more likely to be neurodiverse or have a conduct disorder. They might be more likely to have poor well-being, for example. Okay, and then the next and possibly final point I wanted to make about how we should go about interpreting this report and thinking about the results is that we chose this set of indicators because there's at least some scholarship that suggests that they are linked to the chances of doing well later in life. Frankly, in that first report, we also picked some of these items because Robert Putnam had looked at them in his book. So we were sort of guided on the type of things that belong here. But I also just want to point out that with the sort of mixed evidence in the academic literature on how important these things are. So on some things, like what we might think of as these developmental activities, like reading to children, I think there's absolutely no question whatsoever that this, you know, has a causal relationship with then the child's development and ability to do well at school, and that will probably set them up really well for the rest of their life. But there might be times here where we're looking at a correlation rather than a, you know, really, really solid causal relationship. And as social scientist, I feel obliged to mention that correlation is not causation. And frankly, there are still some things in the social sciences that we don't know, right? And you know, one of the things we mentioned in this report as well is about aspirations. So we asked, or we had data from both the parents and the kids, talking about the likelihood that they'll go on to university. And we do see higher percentages of both the parents and kids from the higher levels of children and parents from the higher socioeconomic households saying that they'll go to university. But, you know, perhaps it's also important to bear in mind that, you know, if a parent has a kid who just doesn't really like the academic stuff at school, but they really like doing things with their hands and making things, and they think this child is going to do much better at doing an apprenticeship rather than going to university, they might adjust their expectations because of what their child is like. So we think it's, you know, it's probably likely that sometimes the things we're talking about, you know, probably move in these complex sort of causal directions. And so the one thing, or the last thing that I wanted to mention then is that one of the findings coming out of the report is this one, that kids from the sort of higher socioeconomic backgrounds report higher levels of drinking alcohol, trying drugs, and vaping. So this is one of these reverse gradients. It's perhaps going in the direction that we wouldn't expect. Certainly, I think there's a very easy stereotype to think about underprivileged kids getting into bad habits, getting in with the wrong crowd, not doing well at school. But obviously, this isn't what we're seeing. But it kind of begs the question then, you know, are these sort of misbehaving or alcohol using high socioeconomic kids going to do badly at school? Is this going to affect their social mobility? And frankly, I don't think we know the answer to that. In the academic literature on alcohol use amongst adults, there is something called the alcohol paradox, which is that, you know, adults from sort of wealthier, better off, higher class backgrounds actually tend to drink alcohol more frequently, but then it's those from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds who are more likely to suffer the negative consequences, perhaps such as, you know, poor health and job loss. So whether this is the case for the high socioeconomic kids here, we don't know. I'm not saying it's okay that a third of our kids say they're drinking alcohol underage, but I think it's just sort of worth thinking about, you know, is this going to influence their social mobility? And then my very final point then is that in Our Kids, Bob Putnam did write about the idea of buffering, so that if a child gets into trouble with drugs or the law or, you know, something, it's going to be those better off families who are going to be in a position to help their kid through it. And that might be because they have more money, but it might also because they have better social connections or possibly a better set of skills for navigating their way through the world of, you know, legal, contact with the legal world or through healthcare and so on. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Lindsay, thank you very much for that. That's a really interesting start. We're going to move quickly on to Jackie. So Jackie, maybe I can start by asking a couple of questions. I know you're going to give us a sort of general overview of our 4 pillars, the SMC's 4 pillars, etc. But how do you think this report fits with the SMC's overall work in the sort of nurturing talent work stream? And why do early years act as such a critical window to intervene and influence social mobility? So you don't have to bring those in straight away. You can deal with them when you like, but if you could cover that would be fantastic. So over to you. You've got 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rob. I think I'll probably just dive right into those questions because I think Lindsay's provided a really nice overview of some of the key findings and considerations for interpretation of this report. And it is quite a long report, as Lindsay mentioned, and as you mentioned, released today. So hopefully folks will enjoy it and dig into it. But just to kind of provide a bit more of an overview of how this report sits within the SMC's wider work. Well, as Lindsay said, in this report, we focus on some of the pathways that link the socioeconomic circumstances of parents to the kind of things that might help or hinder children in terms of their educational and occupational success. And this focus ties into the SMC's wider remit to promote the state of social mobility and monitor the state of social mobility throughout the UK. And so the core concept of social mobility is really to understand how people move up and down the social ladder to a higher or lower or even a similar position to their parents. And you can look at this in a number of different ways, focusing on aspects of occupation, income, education, and so on. But what this really means is that social mobility is a very broad concept, covers a wide range of topics, and we can explore this in a number of different ways and using many different approaches. Now, the way we do this in the Commission, and as you've kind of alluded to earlier, mentioning one of our kind of core pillars, is by kind of breaking down these facets of social mobility and looking at this in 4 different key work streams. Now, I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just provide a brief overview. So the first kind of core work stream and how we look at social mobility and progress is by looking at better data and evaluation. And this is really centered around developing and improving the data available to deepen our understanding of social mobility challenges that different people face. And in this work stream, we look at ways to advocate for better data access, sharing, and linkage that will really help us to better understand the underlying causes and drivers of social mobility. So some of the recent outputs in this work stream include a recent report we've published called Data for Social Mobility. And here we've made specific recommendations for how we can improve social mobility outcomes with the use of better data. And as Lindsay kind of pointed to earlier, maybe this is a good example of an update to some of the data from the 2016 report, which we felt was important to do. So keeping things fresh to understand kind of the key challenges. The second theme and how we look at different facets of social mobility is one that focuses on growing opportunities. And this focuses mainly on economic factors. And here we explore the extent to which the economy can provide a wider variety of opportunities for different people across the country. And so some notable outputs in this work stream recently have been on a series of think pieces. And these have tapped into kind of less traditional aspects of mobility, including aspects of innovation, agglomeration, and occupational regulation. But what we're getting at here are factors of the economy, and kind of trying to spark some thinking around different topics that aren't typically featured in typical social mobility debates. The third theme or core pillar that we look at is called developing talent. And this focuses on the process of moving from the end of compulsory education into the workplace. So we look at aspects of higher education here and also a wider range of opportunities and pathways, technical education, apprenticeships. And some recent outputs from this work stream include our value of qualifications review and accessible report called Charting a Course. And both of these considered, for example, your boost in earnings from studying different subjects at different universities and institutions. But finally, and most relevant for this report, is our theme called Nurturing Talent, which you've mentioned earlier, Rob. And here we cover the aspects of families, early years, and schooling, and how these support children's development. So our current report, The Childhood Origins of Social Mobility, fits within this last theme of nurturing talent. And this is really to understand more about what parents and families have and do to promote their children's development and understand what differentiates families from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And as Lindsay mentioned, the report has raised some really interesting findings and questions about how we perceive these differences. And as we kind of delve into the discussion a bit further today, we'll see that this is not always a simple story, as you've mentioned as well, that children from more affluent families or well-resourced families always come out on top. So we do see this in some cases, as Lindsay mentioned, and we see some strong social class gradients. So for things, for example, like in terms of social capital, these are what we refer to as kind of social ties that the social benefits of social ties and what they bring in terms of networking and resources. And here we see things that such as parents with a higher socioeconomic status engaging in higher levels of neighborhood trust, levels of satisfaction with local amenities, civic engagement, and so on. So in these certain circumstances and certain indicators that we looked at, we see these kind of more typical or more expected social class gradients. But in this report, the picture becomes a lot more nuanced when we look at investments, for example, and what parents are doing. And here we see that things are really quite mixed, and some of the differences across groups are not as big or as pronounced. So for example, we do not see a uniform picture of parents from lower socioeconomic groups and those with less education lacking in investments or activities with their children. And in some cases, which we'll get onto a bit later, we find that these parents are sometimes doing even more than more advantaged parents. So this has been really quite illuminating in many ways. Ultimately, the bottom line being we have different groups of parents doing different things with their children, but all trying to support their children's development. So you might be wondering why we decided to do this work. And the answer is really twofold. I think Lindsay's already touched on one. And as you've kind of asked, I'll tie in the response here about the early years. And the first real reason why we did this is because the early years act as a critical window to intervene and influence social mobility outcomes. And I think, as mentioned earlier, oftentimes there is this tendency to look at social mobility quite late down the line, kind of looking at outcomes later in life. And the key thing here is to really start looking at what's going to shape social mobility over time. And we know that the early years in the home environment set the foundations to have the best start. And this is why this report was so crucial to understand what aspects of home life can really help or hinder social mobility and what we need to draw more attention to. Now, the early years, we know it's undoubted, like undisputed throughout the literature, that this is from birth to 5 is really a key area or a key time in which the environment can influence social mobility outcomes. And it's during this time that the brain is particularly adaptable and receptive, and the context in which development occurs really matters. So we know, for example, that the experiences in home life can drive the connections that shape and strengthen this rapid period of growth, and exposure to high quality environments rich in stimulation and support are really critical. And this is both in the short term and long term. And we also know that during this time, children also learn essential social skills, cooperation, and self-regulation. So parents facing difficult circumstances or hardships may be short on time or lack the resources to support their children to develop these skills, not always. But what we've seen in this report is just how important this can be a little bit later down the line, especially in adolescence, especially when we look at children's well-being and mental health. So together, really intervening early on is paramount. Understanding who might need more help and ensuring that good support is provided can have a far greater impact on a child's kind of future and well-being, instead of relying on intervention further down the line. So that's really why we focus on these early years, this nurturing talent work stream, and why this report was so important. And finally, coming back to kind of the second reason why we did this report, which Lindsay mentioned, is we wanted to provide an update to the 2016 report. Almost 10 years have passed since that report, and we felt the need to update our findings. For some reasons include that some of the indicators have kind of declined in salience or relevance. So for example, in the original report, we looked at things like visits to libraries. This is not to say that libraries are not important. They are very important cultural spaces, but of course, changes have occurred in terms of digital technologies and the declining cost in books. And so we can't necessarily say that children who do not go to libraries are deprived in any way. That's not necessarily the case. They may be accessing materials through different ways. So we really needed an update to kind of reflect some of these changes that have occurred since 2016. And also, of course, the current context in the UK has changed. We have seen a cost of living crisis, which has had strong effects on the lives of millions of families. So increased cost of housing and food and bills. And as Lindsay mentioned, we have to kind of consider these things when we look at the patterns and trends that we've uncovered in this report. And we've also had the effects of the pandemic, the COVID-19 lockdown, and this has shone some light on the mental health and well-being of children and young people. And we felt it was very important to capture these specific changes. So just to recap, the Commission is committed to understanding how the early years influence social mobility outcomes. We do this in our Nurturing Talent work stream. And updating this report was really one way to understand what has changed in terms of time investments by parents, the resources that they have, and as well as looking at changes in behavior and well-being of young children.
Great, thank you, Jackie. And I think that does help broaden out why we've done this report and the context it fits in with the other work that the SMC is undertaking. So thank you very much for doing that. So Jackie mentioned about the update on the 2016 report. And one of the things that I just like to put to Lindsay is obviously you were involved in that first 2016 report, and I just wondered whether you'd seen or noticed any big changes or similarities from this report in comparison to that 2016 report that you might want to highlight.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, it was really interesting for me to be involved in both reports. There are similarities and a few changes. So some of the general picture, I would say, is pretty similar to that general picture we presented in 2016. So, for example, the fact that we see a socioeconomic gradient in parents' social capital, as in, their level of civic engagement and social trust, for example, the level of kind of cultural activities. On most of these outcomes, the higher socioeconomic groups are doing better, or have more than the lower socioeconomic groups. That was true in 2016. It's still true now. We have seen some interesting changes. One of the things we report on is on truancy and exclusions from school. And there used to be a socioeconomic discrepancy in exclusions from school, and that difference seems to have disappeared. And then I've already mentioned, this reverse gradient that we had, that we see in the use of alcohol, vaping, and drugs. Now, we already saw in that old report that higher socioeconomic kids were reporting more alcohol use. So that was already there, but potentially that gap seems to be widening. But the fact that we see this reverse gradient with vaping and drugs is new, so that's a change. Excuse me. We didn't cover vaping in the 2016 result because that's a new thing. And at the same time that vaping is increasing, the smoking of actual cigarettes has really, really declined. So that's also perhaps an important context to bear in mind. And just a couple of other comments about it. Jackie's already alluded to some of these things, but we did take a bit of a different approach this time. Some of the trends we couldn't continue because we didn't have the data. So where we relied on the national cohort studies, we're sort of missing a data point. I'm really happy to say that there is a new cohort study in the field now. So, hopefully when we update this report in 5 years' time, there will be a good new data point coming out. So, we don't always have all the data we need. And then another important point for us that a lot of the data, these big national surveys, they take some time before the data gets cleaned and coded and before we can get our hands on it. And so for a lot of these studies, the latest data point was kind of, 2021, maybe 2022. So these were years when we think, activities are probably still being affected by the pandemic. And so obviously we just had to be careful in our approach, and just being very careful when we're reporting on trends where our last data point is 2021. We need to be really cautious about that. They may well change. And then we've got this new emphasis on well-being, and also a new emphasis on kids' experiences of the pandemic, which when I look back at that 2016, obviously the pandemic hadn't happened then, but some of these things just seem really important all the time, but they were just made salient by the pandemic. So having a computer at home, having somewhere to study, having a good internet connection at home. We see in the report quite a high percentage of kids saying they had to do their homework on a mobile phone because there was no other device available for them during the pandemic. So, so obviously this is new in the new report, and frankly, even though the context was the pandemic and studying at home during that time, but I think it probably applies to just sort of resilience in general, to dealing with difficult times. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lindsay. Just to remind everyone, I'm going to bring any other questions either from the chat or from people that want to speak on video in a couple of minutes. But before that, I just want to ask Jackie a further question, because as you know, Jackie, we are interested in how other characteristics beyond economic background may impact chances of social mobility. So how does this get considered in the report, and is there anything you think we can learn?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Rob. And yes, that's true. This is something that we're trying to unpick across all of our work in the commission. And there is indeed a high degree of complexity to many of the outcomes that we look at. And often looking at one associated factor doesn't really tell us the whole story. What we like to do is consider the kind of co-occurrence and compounding effects of many factors like protected characteristics and geography, as well as socioeconomic background, and potentially the interactions between all of these factors. But when we want to do this type of analysis, this requires the right kind of data and sample sizes, and we don't always have that available to us. Throughout the report, we focus on socioeconomic differences in the lives of children across the UK. But one thing that we acknowledge is that socioeconomic status does not capture everything that is important in family life. And we know, sorry,
we lost you. I think you froze for a second. So carry on.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, no, we'll carry on. So I was saying we focus on the socioeconomic differences in the lives of children in this report. But we also acknowledge that socioeconomic status isn't necessarily going to tell us the full story, and it doesn't capture everything that is important to families and in family life and in shaping outcomes. So we know from our own work, certain things like protected characteristics, such as ethnicity, can vary starkly depending on the type of outcomes we look at. And a good example of this comes from our State of the Nation report that we recently released. And here we look at things like academic achievement. And so, for example, here we found that in the 2022 to 2023 academic year, we found 44% of disadvantaged pupils and 66% of non-disadvantaged pupils met the expected standards in reading, writing, and math. And this was at Key Stage 2, so 11 years. But what we also see is that there are large variations between disadvantaged pupils by ethnic groups. So we see that 71% of disadvantaged children of Chinese background met the expected standard. And what this means is that this group actually performed better than the national average for non-disadvantaged children at Key Stage 2. So again, this highlights some of the nuance, and what it suggests is that we require a much more rounded approach beyond socioeconomic background alone to understand what is going well and for whom and what could be improved. But coming back to this report, where we were somewhat limited in sample sizes to conduct these types of analyses, we did find that some outcomes had, there were greater differences by gender, for example, than by socioeconomic background. And this was really the case when we looked at the well-being of children and young people. So, for example, in looking at questions about feeling nervous or losing confidence in new situations, we found that 35% of 11 to 15-year-old girls agreed with this statement. And this was actually quite a high number. And this was compared to 22% of boys. So we had a 13% difference there between boys and girls. And this difference was much larger than when we looked at the difference between socioeconomic groups. So the difference there is that we found that there were around 40% of lower working class girls that said they agreed with the statement, compared to 31% of girls from the higher professional group. So there was only a 9% difference there. So this is just an example to illustrate that when it came to mental health and well-being and gender, in general, gender appeared to be a more significant factor than socioeconomic background. So taken together, what these findings really tell us is that characteristics beyond socioeconomic background are important to consider. we have to kind of maintain this wider perspective to understand group differences much better. And this is something that the Commission is very keen to explore in greater detail. And as mentioned, we try and do this in our State of the Nation report every year. And when data permits, we try and have take this type of approach in other reports as well.
Thank you, Jackie. That's a really helpful answer. I've got a question from the chat. Well, it's a sort of half statement, half question from, I think it's Meghna Sharma. And she says, I just wanted to check if the previous works looked at factors such as availability of resources, which may not be provided by parents, but other networks or support by government programs. Also, since you mentioned social capital, do we also look at risky behaviours kids may engage with? That's probably one for you, Lindsay, I think.
Yeah, I'll just unmute myself. Yeah, thanks for the question. So some of those things mentioned there in that question, we did not look at. So the idea of receiving, support by particular government programs, we didn't look at that in this report either, frankly, because I think it's quite difficult to get at in some of the national survey data that we use. But it is a really important point, just in general, that the idea of social capital and social resources is really, really wide, and there could be social support coming from a number of places also outside the family. So I think it's an interesting point, and no, we didn't look at it. The second part of that question on risky behaviours. So basically, not apart from the ones we've already mentioned. So we've just mentioned, this alcohol and drugs. So that's the only one that we looked at. Of course, there probably are a wider range of behaviours that we could have included. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks, Lindsay. We've got a couple of questions that are related to geography, and so it's about really whether where somebody lives has a big impact on them and their children's life chances. And Steve McArdle says, is there much of a location effect? London often stands alone in these data. And I think, Lindsay, maybe that's one for you, because obviously we've done a lot of work with our Data Explorer tool and in SON24. So maybe this is a good one to answer for you.
Yeah, so my answer to this question really, for thinking about where someone lives is important. I'm going to give this like a yes and a no answer. So yes, kind of obviously, because well, firstly, the level of economic opportunity is, there are vast differences in the different places in the UK in terms of what's out there for you. If we're thinking about social mobility and the possibility of upward mobility, getting a really good and interesting job, there's a lot more of those available in London and Bristol and maybe Manchester, and not many of those available in Cornwall. So obviously those economic structures really matter. I agree that London is different and a bit special in many ways. It has a population that is on average more highly educated than other areas of the country, and that perhaps is because of those economic opportunities. People have moved into London. So there are things about London that make it really different. Our report shows that people in higher socioeconomic status, families are reporting that they've got higher levels of neighbourhood trust. They report higher satisfaction with the amenities in the local area. And, this is not a surprise to us. We all know that housing is expensive. And if you've got the money to live in a nicer area, you'll live in a nicer area, and it would be a nicer place to live, frankly. I think probably, public transport and the various things that vary are really important. But let me just sort of, pipe in with the no part of my answer. I sometimes feel that there's a lot of emphasis in reporting and discourse in the media and in politics. There's a lot of emphasis on regional differences. And I think it's also important to remember that everywhere in the country has got rich and poor neighbourhoods. There will be more and less privileged kids in London and up in the northeast, and those things matter. We tend to see better outcomes in London and the southeast of the country because on average people are better off in those areas. So yes, where you live matters. I think an overemphasis on region sort of risks forgetting about these important dynamics, which are to do with the economy, opportunities, and the type of people that live in those areas.
Sorry, Jackie, do you want to say something on that? Because I do want you to mention some of the tools that we've developed and so forth. So over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with Lindsay, your response, and we are indeed very interested in geographical variations in all of our work. To Steve's point earlier, in our State of the Nation report, for example, we've seen considerable variation or geographic variation in educational attainment at 5, 11, and 16 years. And very much to his point, we find that all areas of London continue to do well in terms of educational attainment, particularly for FSM eligible pupils. What we've also found developing our composite indices in our State of the Nation, and so our monitoring work, which summarize multiple indicators relating to labor market outcomes. We found that there are fewer what we term kind of promising prospects for young people who've grown up in former mining, industrial, and shipbuilding areas, as well as rural and coastal areas. And many of these post-industrial areas are in the northeast and northwest of England. And what we find is that people who've grown up here tend to end up with lower qualifications and lower pay, are more likely to be in working class jobs than young people from the same socioeconomic background who grew up in different parts of the country with better social mobility. So indeed, it's something that we acknowledge and we want to continue to explore further. The Commission has called for an increased urgency for place-based policies and interventions, acknowledging that, yes, there are different challenges and obstacles in different parts of the country, and that a one-size-fits-all approach is never going to work. But you have brought up a really nice point, Lindsay, that when you start to drill down and look at this in more detail, you have to consider the effects of neighborhoods as well, and you are going to have variations there as well. And to the point, so we have all of this information can be found on our Data Explorer tool. It's an online tool. I'm sure someone in the team can provide a link to that if people are interested in finding out more about how their regions and specific areas in terms of upper tier local authority are doing and faring across different social mobility outcome measures. They can do so. This tool has just been recently updated. So there's a wealth of information there that people can draw on.
Jackie, with relation to that, and maybe also to Lindsay as well, we've had a question from an anonymous attendee, and it's quite a broad question, but wants to know what are some of the relevant national data sets that can be augmented to understand social mobility, given all the factors we've discussed. So what are the real sources of data, national ones, that we can draw from?
Shall I take that one?
Sure.
The UK actually has really high quality and good social science data, and we should bear that in mind. One of the most important sets of data for understanding social mobility over the years have been what we call the cohort studies. And these have been, very expensive, high quality studies that take a cohort of children born in a particular year. We have the first one actually back in 1946, then another cohort in the 50s, one in the 70s. And the wonderful thing about them is that they get followed throughout their whole life. So we can, collect data on what was happening in the life of someone born in, 1972, and then follow them for the rest of their life and see what happens to them, where they end up. So those data sets are just absolutely invaluable. We drew a lot in this report from the one that looked at a cohort of children born around 2000. It's called the Millennium Cohort Study. And actually people like me are kind of excitedly waiting for the next round of data to come up, because obviously those kids are now sort of just finishing university, entering the labour market. So I think there will be more really interesting work coming out of that study. But we did find ourselves with a bit of a gap in the data, because there's been no new cohort studies since then. Obviously 20 years have passed, but there is a new one right now, so we will have some more data in the future. Excuse me. The other data sets that are extremely important include the UK household longitudinal study. It's got a large sample size. It follows people through time. Obviously, this is going to be really important to get at some of these dynamics, to understand, something that happened during someone's child. We can prove a link between that and then what happened to them later on. And then other data sets that are really important include, we didn't cover it in our report, but some of those big, what am I thinking of? The labour force survey, for example. So these studies tend to be pretty expensive to run. Social scientists like me are concerned about declining sort of response rates over time, but they're absolutely essential for us to understand the social landscape of the country. Jackie, please jump in if I've missed any really important ones there.
Jackie, do you want to mention anything? Because obviously we've spoken a lot about data sets and some of the challenges we face. Do you want to quickly mention any of that?
I think we've sort of face similar challenges to what Lindsay has raised. I mean, I think it depends immensely on what age ranges you're looking at. For a lot of our analysis that we use in our State of the Nation report, of course, we try and cover very wide age ranges. Were often covered with similar challenges, just these holes in data. Some of the things that we've encountered specifically relate to aspects of kind of the geographical breakdowns and how granular we can get in terms of the breakdowns we'd like to provide. These are some of the challenges that we faced. So kind of speaking to the question earlier about looking at geographical variation, that was one thing that we weren't necessarily able to do. Also, as I mentioned earlier, when we want to look at kind of interactions or the kind of co-occurrence and combination and interactions of different factors and effects, such as protected characteristics and socioeconomic background, again, this is something that requires very large data sets. So in this report, there were some questions about how some of some of the outcomes that we found would vary by ethnic groups and socioeconomic background, but we just simply weren't able to do it because the sample sizes weren't large enough. So these are kind of some of the challenges that we encounter. But of course, as I mentioned, is one of the core work streams in the Commission. We're advocating for better data for social mobility analysis. And I think this is something that, all researchers would appreciate.
So we're coming to the end of our hour. So I'm just going to finish by asking you a question each. Same question to both of you, really. And Lindsay, if you take it first, what's the one big thing that you would like people to take away from your report?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because obviously we looked at so many things and the findings are kind of messy. But for me, there is quite a subtle but consistent picture that kids who are growing up in households, where the parents are in a higher socioeconomic class or have higher education, just get a little bit more of all the good stuff. So they're getting more in the way of cultural activities, and a sort of range of indicators. They're living in nicer areas. Their well-being is a bit better. So sometimes the findings are sort of complex and a bit mixed, but I think the overall picture sort of fits this idea of the higher socioeconomic kids just having a slightly easier life. And so why I think it's important to think about that is because, obviously some of them may be thriving at school, and they're thriving at school because their circumstances, what their parents have and what their parents do allows them to. And equally then there may be some, bright kids that aren't doing as well as they might do because they don't have those really good set of circumstances at home and all the cultural stimulation and activities and so on. I meant to mention it earlier on, actually, just remembering this one thing. Sometimes the small details in the report were interesting. So we asked parents why they weren't doing particular cultural activities. The high socioeconomic status parents who weren't doing any cultural stuff said it's because they didn't have enough time. But quite a chunk of the lower socioeconomic status ones said it was because they were in poor health. Now, we're probably talking about a relatively small fraction of the population here, but for me, that's sort of really important to think about those barriers that are preventing those parents and then those kids from being able to have all the inputs they need to do really well.
Great. Jackie, what's the one thing you would take away?
Yeah, I think for me, the most important kind of finding and takeaway was from our chapter on parental investments. And I think that I think we've alluded to this previously, that lower socioeconomic groups might invest less in their children or the home learning environment. And that is indeed the case in some circumstances, but it's not always true. And what kind of spoke to me was that we need to take a much closer look and a much more detailed look to see what is and isn't being done. So we found this very nuanced and mixed picture in terms of investments, essentially in what kind of activities parents are doing to enrich the home learning environment. And we didn't really see that there was a uniform picture of parents from lower socioeconomic groups spending less time or investing little in their children. In many cases, they were doing just as much, such as helping with homework, writing, and math homework specifically, and sometimes even doing more than advantaged parents. But the activities were a bit different. So, for example, they were doing more activities centered around music, stories, and arts. So the key takeaway that I would really emphasize is that all parents, irrespective of backgrounds, are trying to enrich their children. But we need to understand more about what exactly parents are doing, and what we can do to help to support them to engage in more activities that can foster these kind of positive developmental outcomes. So I think that that's one thing to reinforce from what we found here. And it is an interesting finding from my perspective.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Well, we've come to the end of a very fast hour. It's gone like lightning, as they always do. Thank you so much to everyone that put in questions and for coming along. Many thanks to Lindsay and to Jackie. I found your presentations really interesting and informative, and I think everybody else would agree with that. I'll be talking a bit more about the Childhood Origins report in a commentary that is coming out on the SMC website and on our social media channels soon. So please do look out for that. We released our Value of Qualifications podcast in August. And of course, in September, we launched the latest State of the Nation report. Our policy recommendations based on the report's findings will be published later this autumn. So please do keep a lookout for that. The website, the SMC website, is getting regularly updated, so please do keep an eye on that as well. And I hope to see some of you at one of our in-person events later in the year. A recording of this webinar will be posted on the website very soon. So again, thank you for your attendance today, and the SMC looks forward to engaging again with you very soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. I think we've just got a couple more attendees to sign off, and then we can do a debrief.
Laura, I think it might be okay to go ahead. We could maybe stop the recording.